All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Yibaneh Center. And it's a great school. It's a great honor to be able to study with you this evening. My name is Aaron Goldscheider, and I'm the editor of Torah Tidbits. And that's one of the things that I do. A great honor to be able to work with that publication, with the OU here in Israel. And we're going to learn this evening. We're going to learn actually something that is based in Rav Kook, a number of ideas from Rav Kook. But we're going to learn a halacha together. And with that halacha, we're going to explore the meaning behind this halacha. And actually what we're going to be looking at is a bracha, is a blessing that many have not recited for a very long time. It seems to be making a comeback, and it's something that we all can recite on possibly on a regular basis. So we're going to learn a halacha that hopefully is something that we can kind of incorporate into our lives. It could be that some of us do this on a regular basis. I imagine that there are those here that have not done this. When I grew up, and for many, many years, I never recited this bracha, this blessing. It's a blessing that's found in the Gemara. It's a blessing that's found in the Shulchan Aruch. It's a blessing that's found in the Rambam. And somehow, and I think this is like somebody needs to do some research in this area. That's not going to be the topic tonight, of how it was lost, how so many years, and perhaps maybe hundreds of years, that this blessing has not been recited. So let's get into it. So what blessing am I referring to? So it's a blessing that is found in Birkat HaMazon, that is found as part of benching. And let's begin here, actually, that brings us up to date. If you look at the art scroll bencher, if you look at the art scroll sitter, or the art scroll bencher, this is a bencher that was printed in 1987. And one of the great things about Art Scroll, and I'm sure all of us are familiar with Art Scroll, we enjoy using Art Scroll. One of the things that they did is, by the way, trivia question, what was the very first publication of Art Scroll? Anybody know?
Megillah.
That's right, Megillat Esther was the very first publication. There's a beautiful story behind that Meir Zlotowitz, who is the founder of Art Scroll, he wasn't founding Art Scroll at the time. A good friend of his passed away, and he wanted to do something in honor of his beloved friend who passed away at a young age. And he said, I'm going to sit for 30 days before the shloshim of my friend, and I'm going to produce a sefer. And he sat for 30 days, and he wrote that first translation and commentary to Megillat Esther. He put that on the market. Everybody absolutely loved it. And from there, we have what Art Scroll is today, the thousands of publications and the Talmud and everything that they've done. But I always think about that idea that it started with a chesed for somebody else. If he didn't have that, that sensitivity, and that he didn't say that's what I'm going to do, maybe we would not have Art Scroll as we have it today. It all comes from chesed. Okay.
I think he was also the first to be able to do the print.
Yeah. Well, he himself. That was his business. He had a bar mitzvah and a wedding invitation that he produced, or published wedding invitation. So he had that skill, and he kind of took that skill. He brought that in like formatting the page, but also he was a great Talmud Chacham that he was able to do that. Okay, but one of the great things that Art Scroll did was, and I guess people kind of just took it for granted, that people knew their way around a siddur, and that they knew the instructions, they knew when to bow, and when to stand, and when to say the following, and when to omit the following. And they put that very precisely. They have that in the siddur. That's what they added to the siddur, and also that was one of their great contributions. But here we find something in their bencher which they don't usually do, and they tell us something about this prayer. Okay, here we go. This is page 1. This is straight from, you can open up the Art Scroll bencher, or you find this also in the siddur as well. The Talmud in Brachot 46a gives a rather lengthy text of the blessing that a guest inserts here for the host. So what is the halacha? And I just mentioned a moment ago that I wanted to share a halacha with you. The halacha is very simple. If you are sitting at somebody else's table, that you have an obligation to bless the host who is providing the meal for you. I never knew that. I never saw that growing up. And As I just mentioned, the Gemara says it should be done, the Shulchan Aruch says it should be done, and everyone says it should be done, and somehow people were not doing it, have not been doing it. And our scroll goes on with this little introduction to the blessing. It says it's quoted with minor variations in the Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim 201, and many authorities are at a loss to explain why the prescribed text has fallen into disuse in favor of the briefer version commonly used. This you don't usually find in the Art Scroll when they give you instructions, as they add like a little comment here, and they say, we don't really know why people are not saying this blessing, and why is it that it has fallen into disuse? And a lot of people are just saying, the harachaman, in the harachaman, hu yivarech et bal habayit u balat habayit hazeh. So that I think we're more familiar with. That is something that I was familiar with kind of growing up, that you would say that if you were in somebody else's home, if you were a guest at a meal, that you would say, harachaman, hu yivarech et bal habayit hazeh. But that's not the appropriate way of doing it. That's not the full text. You should recite this full text. Now, this is what's found in the Gemara. So, again, just going back to this little introduction of Art Scroll, it fell into disuse in favor of the briefer version commonly used. The text that's found in the Shulchan Aruch is the following. Okay, so we're going to look at that text in a moment. We're going to see the Gemara itself. But before we look at the Gemara, I want to just share one other interesting, anecdote around this. And it's called, by the way, in Hebrew, the Birchat HaOreach. So if you want to sound learned, so that's the term that is used. The Birchat HaOreach, the bracha of the guest. The bracha that's recited by the guest when you are having a meal in somebody else's home. This is from a sefer called Mesorat Moshe. This Moshe is referring to Rav Moshe Feinstein. And you have a collection in this book, Mesorat Moshe, the traditions of Rav Moshe Feinstein, some anecdotes and some stories about his life and some of his minhagim. And it has the following. This is Mesorat Moshe, Chelik Beis, Amud Lamites. It says, Ve'eze Mosad Shalchu. I'm just going to read a few lines to you. There was a certain organization that sent to Rav Moshe Feinstein. By the way, Rav Moshe Feinstein is the great posek. He lives on the Lower East Side, considered to be maybe the greatest posek in America in the past generation. And a certain organization printed up a Birkat HaMazon, a laminated text, which they wanted to send out to people as like a fundraiser. I don't know if anybody has ever received something like that. You have different organizations that try to come up with some shtick, like something that they send out to you. So maybe like a Hoshanos card, or I remember the old days, anybody old enough to remember this, they used to send out a packet of charoset, a certain organization, as a fundraiser. It came in a box in a little like aluminum, it wasn't a tin, like in this piece of aluminum inside, you opened it up and there was like a little instruction to add water, add wine, and that would be your charoset. And that was your, like this gift before Rosh Hashanah. But with receiving that gift, they expected that you sent something in the mail as part of this tzedakah. So you have a lot of organizations that do that, trying to come up with a new idea. And here, Moshe Feinstein receives from a particular organization a bencher. This bencher is a laminated card. On the one side, it has the benching. And he writes the following, Ve'eze Mosad Shalchu Kartis Plastik Shekatuv Alav Mitzad Echad. On one side, it said Nusach Shel Birchat HaMazon. One side, it had Birchat HaMazon. Mitzad Sheni. And on the other side, Hanusach Sha'areach Sarich Levarech Bal Habayit. And what they came up with, and again, because they took note of the fact that benchers, for the most part, did not have the Birchat HaOreach. And I'll mention this now, by the way. One of the most famous benchers, and a bencher that I grew up with, a beloved bencher, is called the NCSY bencher. Anybody familiar with the NCSY bencher? Yeah, the NCSY bencher. It's one of the classic benchers, especially, I guess, in our community through the OU, NCSY. What was so great about the NCSY bencher? What was their chiddush? What was their novelty in that bencher that made it a big success?
The little songs.
All the songs, that's right. There's like 30, 40 songs in the back. So not only did you have the benching, but you had all the popular songs. And it was a great way for people at a Shabbos table or at a kumsitz, whatever it was. You had this bencher. That was their That was their great idea, and it was a great idea. So in that bencher that I grew up with, the NCSY, the classic NCSY benchers of the 70s and 80s, if you went to the benching, it did not have Birchat HaOreach. It did not, this great bencher did not have this blessing that we're talking about this evening. It did not include that. They then came out with another edition in the last 10 years or so, maybe last 15 years, and now you'll find the Birchat HaOreach. You'll find this blessing that a guest is to recite for the host. So you see something interesting here. Again, it was, for some reason, ArtScroll itself tells you that it fell into disuse for whatever reason, and not just in the last 100 years, it seems like for many hundreds of years, because you have some of the early, I guess, Achronim that are already asking the question, why is it that we do not have the Birchat HaOreach? In the home of the Brisker Rav here in Yerushalayim, so again, the benchers did not have Birchat HaOreach, so when there was a guest at the meal, they would pull a Gemara off the shelf, and they would put the Gemara down, they would open up to the daf, where it has the Birchat HaOreach, and when they came up to that part of the benching, so the Brisker Rav would push the Gemara in front of the one who was benching and said, here's the text. But that text was nowhere to be found. It was not in the benchers. You could only find it in the Gemara. But the Gemara says it must be done, the Rambam says it must be done, the Shulchan Aruch says it must be done, and somehow, again, we'll let somebody here do that research and to try to figure out why, where it was lost. But the topic this evening is the meaning and the importance of this bracha, and we'll see that in a moment. So when Rav Moshe Feinstein received this laminated, again, this organization sent it to him to kind of get an approval from the Gadol Ador that this is, that this should be sent out and appropriate. Ukishera'a oto Rabbeinu. I'm on the second line, the last three words, second line, right in the middle of the first page. When he saw this, Amar zet davar tov me'od. He said, this is excellent. This is a really nice thing that we're bringing back this bracha, shezeh hanusach shemuzkar b'gemara, because this is the text that we find in the Gemara, Sh'Rabbeinu Amru, Keshehu Oreach. And this is what Rav Moshe Feinstein would say as well. He was makpid, the great Gadol Ador, Moshe Feinstein Zatzal, he was makpid to say, the Birchat Oreach, Kegon b'mansi. Anybody know the Hebrew word mansi? Well, it's not a Hebrew word, but Muncie, New York. Whenever he was in Muncie, New York, he would say this when he was in Iraq. Now this, by the way, tells you something very interesting. What was he doing in Muncie, New York? Where was he in Iraq? Trivia question. Where was he regularly? He would go to Muncie for Shabbos. Who was he staying with?
Son-in-law?
He was staying with his son-in-law, that's right, and his daughter. Right, Rav Moshe David Tendler, who was a Rosh Yeshiva University, a famous biologist and Talmudist. He taught in the morning at YU, he taught a Gemara shir. In the afternoon, he taught biology and science. And you have a lot of the responsa, a lot of the tshuvot of Moshe Feinstein that he describes how he's talking over these issues with his son-in-law. And that's Rav Moshe David Tendler, who's in Muncie. But what's interesting here as well, and this kind of, we'll touch on this, that he said the Birchat HaOreach when he was in his daughter and son-in-law's home for Shabbos. In other words, he saw himself as an Oreach, that I'm a guest, even though, right, I'm in my daughter and son-in-law's house, but they're providing meals for me. They're providing a place for me to stay over Shabbos. And I need to bless the Oreach. So this is the great Rav Moshe Feinstein who's blessing his son and his son-in-law and his daughter and their family. Okay, so with that introduction,
Why wouldn't they see each other as a guest? I mean, it's not as well.
what's that? So you're saying it's obvious that it would? Yeah, okay, they're all family. You might say they're all family. You have the Rav Moshe Feinstein, we're sitting around. Is that really an Oreach? Is he really a guest? So, by the way, I'll bring that question or that issue, which relates to this, and that is a child that is at their parents' table. So the Magen Avram says the following, that a child who's at a parent's table, that child does recite the Birchat HaOreach. In other words, that's if you're living in the house or if you're visiting the house, so that's also you're considered to be an Oreach. Maybe we need to remind our children every so often, you're a guest in this house. Just remember that. You're a guest here. So the child needs to recognize that as well, that my parents are providing for me. They're putting a Shabbos meal on the table. I'm an Oreach. As much as I'm a family member, I'm an Oreach here as well. I'm a guest here in this house.
In our shul, we do the third meal. It's my shul.
Yeah.
Am I guest in my shul? Or is it?
Very good. You know what? So there's a... the question is if you... So let's say you're, and this is a good question here. Let's say you're having Shalosh Shudis in the Yibanes Center. One of the most beautiful things in Yerushalayim is Shalosh Shudis here. If anybody has not experienced that, you should come here to experience a beautiful Shalosh Shudis. So let's say Rav Poston says, I'd like you to lead the benching. I call on you to lead the benching. Do you include the Birchat HaOreach? You're in a shul, right? You're having Shalosh Shudis with a group of people. Is that Birchat HaOreach? So I'll tell you the following. Okay, where you're a member. So I don't know the answer per se, but listen to the following. So this, Rav Hershel Schachter is considered Shlita, one of the great Gedolei Tov of America today. So he was in the shul with Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz. He's also quite a exceptional Talmud Chacham. He's the head of the Smicha program of Yeshiva University. So Rav Schachter was a scholar in residence at Rabbi Leibowitz Shul in Woodmere, New York. And he was sitting next to Rav Schachter there was a communal meal in the shul, and he listened to him while he benched, and he heard that Rav Schachter recited the Birchat HaOreach. In other words, that he was a guest, that he felt that he was a guest in the shul, and he was blessing the rabbi, he was blessing maybe the board of the shul, whoever it is who is to be blessed in that setting. So that question, if you're in a shul and you're saying, and at a meal and you're leading the benching, at least that's one example of
So is it only
yes.
the person leading the benching or anyone?
Oh, so we'll get, okay, good. So so let's mention that right now, which is an excellent question, which we'll see the Gemara kind of touches on that. The Aruch HaShulchan writes the following, that every person who's sitting, and not only the one who's leading the benching, everyone, that's both men and women, are to recite this as well. Anyone who is a guest at the table, when you're a guest at the table, you should be reciting the Birchat HaOreach. So that's something to think about. That's going to be halacha l'maisa in about 45 minutes, right? When everyone here is going to be sitting around a meal, you're an oreach, you're a guest in another setting. There is a host here. That everybody who's sitting at the table is to recite the Birchat HaOreach. By the way, just by a show of hands, not to embarrass anyone, because I never recited this. How many people recite this on a regular basis when they're guests in people's homes? You never heard of it, right? No, I never heard of it either. I didn't grow up with it either. Yes.
Shaded in gray.
Now it's shaded in gray. Okay. All right. So here we go. So by the way, so if we've learned that, just dayenu, that if we learned a halacha, and halacha that we can now, bring to our Jewish, to our religious lives, to our spiritual lives, it's a very, very beautiful thing. Okay. So now we've spoken a lot about the Birchat HaOreach. Now let's take a few minutes to actually see the Birchat HaOreach. Let's see it, and then we're going to see a few comments, beautiful comments by Rav Kook, his interpretation of the Birchat HaOreach. Okay. So let's see the Gemara itself. Let's see where it first appears in the Gemara. It appears in the Gemara Brachos, right? You might imagine it's there because that's where you have all the halachos of Brachos. It's Mem Vav Amud Aleph. And let's begin here. It begins in the following way. Kiha. So this is the bottom of page 1. Kiha de Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. A teaching that comes from the great Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. And he says the following. Bal Habayis Botseya, that the Bal Habayis, the host, should be the one who breaks bread, who cuts the bread, who makes the hamotzi. By the way, is that what we generally see in a Jewish home? That the Bal Habayis is the one that makes the hamotzi? Do we give to somebody else that honor of making hamotzi? No. And it seems that's what the Gemara says. It's not saying that you honor somebody else with. I remember in the old days at a bar mitzvah, you'd call up so-and-so who's going to make the hamotzi. I'd call on Uncle Herbie, who's going to be making the hamotzi. So that's what, I don't know, the bar mitzvahs that I went to in the 80s. Right. You had this big challah, and you would honor somebody in the family to recite the hamotzi. Okay. That may be okay. But the truth is, the Gemara says that in a home, and again, we can think about Shabbos, when generally this is done, so the Balabayas is the one that is the host, is the one who's Botzeh. He's the one who breaks bread. The Oreach, and the guest should be the one who is Mevarech. He should be the one to lead the benching. Balabayas Botzeh. The Gemara says, why is it that the Balabayas is the one who is the one to cut the bread, make hamotzi? Kedei sheyivtza ba'ayin yafeh. Because we want that person who's making the hamotzi and is going to be breaking the bread, cutting the bread, that he should do it with in a Thank you. In a generous way. He should cut large pieces. Now, if we give it to the guest, well, we don't know exactly what the guest is going to do. He's not going to be that comfortable. First of all, you don't know what he's going to do. He may not be comfortable. It's not really his bread. It's not his amotzi. So he'll just cut little pieces for everyone. And that's I've always tried to do that over the years, to give a nice, healthy size of challah to everyone. And not just cut, some people like cutting it like very small pieces for everyone. So it sounds like the Gemara says the best practice is large pieces for everyone. And therefore the balabayas is the one that cuts the bread. Ve'oreach mevarech, and the guest is the one that should should lead the benching. Ve'oreach mevarech. Why is that? Is that right? Okay. So it sounds like the Gemara says that's not the ideal. And the truth is, in my home and what I grew up with, we always honored somebody else with the benching. And that's usually what I've seen, that the host will ask somebody at the table to lead the benching. And that's what the Gemara suggests. And why is that? And the Gemara gives the following answer, Kadesh yivarech bal habayit, in order that that person can now give a bracha to the balabayas. Now, in order to understand that, or at least one interpretation of the Gemara is, that in the time of the Gemara, there was one person who would bench, and everybody would listen to that benching and answer amen to that benching. I think in some Sephardic circles, that is a custom, that everybody listens, like similar to we do like with Kiddush on Friday night. Right? One person is reciting it, and everybody's listening and answers amen, and that's the custom that we have for Kiddush. It seems that may have been the custom for Birkat HaMazon as well, and therefore we want to give it to somebody else, because then there's the opportunity for that person to then bless the host of the household. Okay, good. Yes, that's true. That's true. So yes, so often you see if there's a Kohen to honor a Kohen, possibly a Levi as well. Okay, so that's the introduction to the Birchat HaOreach. Now let's look at the Birchat HaOreach and the actual blessing that is recited, and this now becomes the Birchat HaOreach that's found in our benchers today. That's found, again, for a long time it was not there. It made a comeback, Baruch Hashem. Samai Mevarach, what is the bracha that is recited? Yehi Ratzon, it should be your will, God. Shelo Yevosh Bal Habayis, that this Bal Habayis, that the host of the home, should not be embarrassed. Lo Yevosh Bal Habayis, Ba'olam Hazeh, in this world, Velo Yikalem, and he should not be humiliated, Le'olam Haba. Now, that's how we begin the blessing of the host. I think that's a very strange way. I think that should be somewhat surprising to all of us. Why do we begin that way? Why is that of everything that we can choose to bless the balabayas, to bless the host? We're sitting at a table, we're at a Friday night, we're at a Shabbos table, and the first thing that we say, you shouldn't feel any embarrassment. You shouldn't be embarrassed in this world and the world to come. Sounds a little bit strange. So we'll look at the meaning behind that according to Rav Kook. And now we go to the next part. The Rebbe Mosif Badvarim. Then Rebbe added the following. In other words, that you should add the following to the blessing the way that you bless the host. V'yitzlach ma'od. Looks like that v'yatzlach, but I think that may be v'yitzlach ma'od b'chol nechasav. That you should be very successful with all of your possessions. V'yu nechasav u'nechasenu mutzlachim. That all of our possessions should be with great success. Ukravim la'ir, they should be close to the city. And we're going to look at the meaning of that phrase. What does that mean? You should be successful in your parnasa, you should be successful with all your possessions. What does it mean, ukravim la'ir, should be close to the city? Ve'al yishlot satan, and the satan should not have power over you. He should not be able to control you in any way. Lo b'masa yadav, not in the actions of your hands. Ve'lo b'masa yadenu, and not in the actions of our hands. Ve'al yizdaker lo lefanav, it should not stand up before you. Ve'lo lefanenu shum davar hir hurchet, you shouldn't have any thought of sin. Ve'aveira, also a sin, transgression. Ve'avon, iniquity, sin. Me'ata ve'adolam, now and forever. So by the way, just look at the art scroll, and this is what is recited. This is the custom based on the Gemara. Just to look at the text one more time. Open up an art scroll siddur, you'll see this. Open up. Does the Chabad have it? So. Chabad doesn't have it?
Where would I find the meaning of the
in the Harachamans towards the end. So if you look at just look at the text that we have, and it's essentially what the Gemara says. Yehi Ratzon. Shelo Yevosh v'lo yikalem bal habayis hazeh lo be'olam hazeh v'lo be'olam haba v'yitzlach v'yatzliach b'chol nechasav v'yu nechasav mutzlachim u'kavim la'ir v'al yishlot satam b'masi yadav v'al yizdakek lefanav shum davar chei v'yirur avon me'atav v'olam. The Chabad has it? Chabad does not have it. Interesting. As I said, that version, right? That siddur.
This is not this version. This is Chabad.
Yeah,
Who's the dirt? Standard issue.
Chabad has not put it in their siddur. Okay. So if you look at the Rambam, look at the top of page 2. The Rambam, again, everyone codifies this. The Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam, everyone says this must be said. And look at just to see the language of the Rambam. Ukishimavarecha oreach etzel bal habayit. And when you are a guest at somebody's home, mosif ba bracha lebal habayit. You must add a bracha, a particular bracha for the bal habayit. Ketzad, what is that bracha? And then he quotes the bracha that we find in the Gemara. Yehi ratzon shelo yevosh bal habayit be'olam hazeh v'lo yikalem le'olam haba, etc., etc. He doesn't write the entire thing. You look at the Gemara for the remainder of that. But here, I'll just add the following, which the Rambam adds very beautifully. And he says, "V'yesh lo reshut." The person who is blessing the host, he has permission lehosif. He can add to it. That's the basic text. But if you want to add a little bit more, and you want to say some nice things about the Bal Habayit and the success that he should have, the joy that he should have, the Rambam says you can add whatever you like. Lehosif b'birkat Bal Habayit ulaha'arich ba. If you can add to it, even better. So you have the text that the Gemara itself tells us. This is the text that should be recited. And the Rambam says, read that text, make sure to recite that when you say benching, and then add, if you like to add a little bit on your own, you're welcome to do so. Okay. So that is the Gemara. That is the Rambam. It's found in the Mishnah Berurah, it's found in the Aruch HaShulchan, it's found in every halachic source that should be added to our benching. Okay, yes, please.
What do you recommend if the host, the Bal Habayit, is a Kohen? Should he pass the...
That's a good question. It's a good question. I think he can be mochel on his kavod, but it's a good question.
It's not a chiyuv to give to the Kohen.
That's right. It's not a chiyuv to give to the Kohen. And again, the Kohen can be mochel on that kavod. If he wants to give that kavod to somebody else, it's not an absolute. Even we even do that with even with an aliyah, that we'll ask a Kohen sometimes to step out and to allow somebody else to receive the. That's a minhag that many shuls and the community adheres by. Okay. All right. So what I'd like to do now is we're going to just take the next few minutes to appreciate and to understand this bracha. And I think if we appreciate, when it comes to any halacha, the more that we understand it and we appreciate what it is that we're saying, the more meaningful it will be for us. Okay, so we have one of the beautiful works that we have from Rav Yitzchak Cohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, is that he wrote, and this is really unique, and many of the Gedolim did not do this, but he wrote a commentary on all of the Haggadic texts of the Gemara. So the Gemara, we know, is really split into two. We have the halachic part of the Gemara, all the analysis of the Gemara, and then everything else is what's called the Haggadah, right? Everything else, which are the stories and the insights and the wisdom and a bracha and the meaning of a bracha. So all of that's found in the area of Haggadah. He wrote a work called the Ein Hayah, and he wrote in his lifetime on brachos, the first Masechta, and Shabbos, the second Masechta. That's essentially what he accomplished in his lifetime. He has thousands of interpretations in those 2 volumes of those Gemaras. So we have his commentary here. Okay, so the first thing that is let's focus on the blessing itself. So what's the first thing that we say in the blessing? That the person should not. Our blessing to the host is that shelo yevosh v'lo yikalem bal habayit hazeh. That this Bal Habayit, that this host shouldn't feel any humiliation or any embarrassment in his life. And why does he begin that way? So the interpretation of Rav Kook is the following. And here I'd like to read, we'll just take, as we study Rav Kook, I always like to read, to see the language of Rav Kook, to appreciate, because his Hebrew and the way that he presents his ideas is also very, very beautiful and worth looking at. So we'll just look at a few lines from Rav Kook as we make our way through his Perush here. So if you're on page 2, it's letter A. It says Einaya, and on the opening part of the bracha, Mai mivarech yehi ratzon shelo yevosh bal habayit v'chulei. He writes the following: Mipnei shebehechrech. He says that what happens is when the guest is at a person's home, ha'oreach ha'ochel delav delay. When a person is eating from a meal that's not his own meal, when he's sitting at somebody else's table, lo yinatzel mibusha. That it really is quite difficult for a person not to feel a little sense of humiliation or embarrassment. In other words, here I am sitting at your table, and I feel a little bit less. In other words, that I'm not the one hosting. Maybe I don't have, the food or the means to be able to do that. And here I am at somebody else's table. Whenever, says Rav Kook, whenever you're in that setting, you feel a little bit diminished. And I don't know if it means you're fully embarrassed, humiliated, but there's a little tinge of that feeling. So therefore, says Rav Kook, al kein na'ehi hatfilah. He says this is actually now a very beautiful tefillah that the guest is offering to the host. Al kein na'ehi hatfilah hazot le'oreach al bal habayit shebercho. We're blessing the bal habayit shescharo yiyeh, that he should be rewarded mishalem velo yitarev ba srach busha uchlima. He should never, the bal habayit should never experience any sense of humiliation in his own life. So this is what Rav Kook says. Why do we begin that way? Why does the guest begin with that blessing, that particular blessing? Because the guest is feeling a little bit of that, and now that becomes a natural bracha. That's like a real bracha that we're now giving to the host. Right? I'm in need. I'm sitting at a table that's not my table. There's a little tinge of humiliation, of embarrassment that I don't have, that I'm relying on somebody else. You should never experience that in your life. And that goodness that you're sharing with me, right, and that I'm sitting at this table, you should always have that. You should always be blessed in that way. You should never have to turn to somebody else, right, for help. So that's the way that Rav Kook understands the opening of this bracha. It's really now a very natural bracha. It's a very real bracha. There was something that I'm experiencing, something that I'm feeling, that I'm now turning to you and saying, you should never know of that. Right? You should never feel any sense of humiliation or embarrassment. So that's the way that he understands the opening line. That's why the oreach, that's why the guest begins with, you should never feel any busha. The rest of your life, you should never have to feel that you need to ask, or you need to be, you should feel that you're in need of others. We spoke about this on Shabbos, that Rav Schachter, and I've heard Rav Schachter say this a couple of times, Rav Schachter of YU, as I mentioned when the Gedolei Torah, he said, when you invite a friend over for Shabbos, he says that's not hachnasas orchim. He says that's chesed. That's a nice thing to do, and maybe you get a mitzvah of chesed, of kindness, gemilas chasadim. But achnasas orchim is when you're inviting somebody that doesn't have a place, right? That mitzvah, the idea of achnasas orchim, that technically that mitzvah is where somebody doesn't have a place for Shabbos, where somebody doesn't have a meal, when somebody is in need and you open your door to that person. That's the mitzvah of achnasas orchim. Like going back to Avram Avinu, that he's sitting by his tent, and those people that didn't have what to drink, right, didn't have a meal, inviting them in. That's hachnasas orchim. That doesn't mean the other isn't also beautiful, and it's not. We're not saying that's not chesed. That is chesed, but achnasas orchim is that. So this idea also of the host and sitting with a guest, that the guest very often is a person that may not have a place, and therefore that's the opening of the bracha. You should never feel that tinge of humiliation, embarrassment, of need. You should never know that in your life. That's the opening of the bracha. Okay, next. We say the person's parnasa you should be successful in your parnasa, which by the way makes a lot of sense, because that success of your parnasa, look at what you've done. You've opened your door to me, that you have the means, you have the ability to do this, you have the ability to open your home to guests. You should continue, Hashem. So that's the second part of the bracha. Hashem, you should continue to bless this person with parnasa, that he should be successful. But he then says something. He says, ukrovim la'ir. What does it mean to be karov la'ir? You should be close to the city. That's the text, and again, that's the Gemara's text, and that's what we use in the bracha that's used in Birchas HaOrchim HaOreach today. So this is what Rav Kook says. What does it mean that we're praying that the person should be krovim la'ir? He writes, Shleimu ha'adam benafsho midotav. The person wants to master their midot. They want to excel in midot. Shemehem totzaot lechol minei hashleimot hapratit. That in a way that you're going to affect every area of your character development. Tzelech v'titaleh rak be'ofen shelo yasim merkaz chayav rak inyano haprati. Says Rav Kook, if you want to become great in midot, it's really not about thinking about your own life and how you're going to improve your own midot. How do you become great in midot? Ki'im inyanei hatzibur. The more that you're concerned with others, that, he says, is the key to improving midot. Okay, there is a place for self-reflection and to think about what is it that I need to change. But Rav Kook says, you know what? Don't spend so much time doing that. You can do that for a little bit, take some quiet time and think about. But you know how if you want to really improve? Start reaching out to others. Provide for others. Care for others. Fill your life with concern for others that are in need and how you can help the community at large. If you do that, then you're going to be growing. Says Rav Kook. That's his. Maybe there are those that would disagree. Rav Kook says that's the essence. That's the secret ingredient to growth and to improving midot. To be more involved with people's lives and caring about others. So that, he says, is what we're praying for. You should be karav le'ir. The simple meaning of that, your job, you should be close to the city. That you shouldn't have to spend so much time on the road. You shouldn't spend a lot of time on the train. I used to live in Mount Kisco, New York, in Upper Westchester, and everybody in my shul, they spend about an hour and a half going into the city, an hour and a half getting back. They spend 3.5 hours a day just getting to work and getting home from work. Literally more than 3 hours a day doing that. So that's one way of reading this bracha. Your work should be close at hand, karav le'ir, right? You should be able to, your work, you shouldn't have to take so much time in your transportation and getting home from work.
But of times it would be even longer. People went for
that's right, very good. So, but Rav Kook has a different interpretation. It says karav le'ir means that you should always be involved in the city, meaning with others, with the needs of others, with the greater community, with the community at large. That's the bracha that you're giving this person, that you should always be involved. As you're involved right now, as I'm sitting at your table and you're concerned with others, you should continue to do that, because that's really the key to growth and excelling in midot. And then Rav Kook says the following, and this is interesting, because what is this? This also seems to come out of like left field. It says, V'lo yishlot satan, and the satan is generally, that's the Yetzer Hara, should not take hold of you, shouldn't have an influence on you. Lo b'maaseh yada, v'lo b'maaseh yadenu, v'lo yizdaker lo lefanenu, v'lo lefanenu, shum davar hir horchet ve'avon. Okay, so what is this last part of the prayer that we're praying for the Balabayit, that the Yetzer Hara, or the language of the Gemara is the Satan, should not have influence, should not impact you. So Rav Kook says the following. Rav Kook says, Omnam, here if you want to see the language of Rav Kook, this is in section C. Omnam chayei hachevra mivi'im gamkein michsholim imahem. So he says, we just bless that person that you should be very involved with community, with others. But he says the more that we're involved with others, then there are a lot of stumbling blocks. In other words, it's easier just to kind of go into sit in the shul, or kind of sit alone, a little bit of isolation, and we think that that's how we're going to improve. Rav Kook says, no, you gotta be involved in the community. But the more that we're involved with others and involved with the community at large, and we're out there on the street, and we're interacting with a lot of different people and a lot of different influences, well, with that, there are a lot of challenges as well. So that's now the second part of the bracha. You should be part of the most successful and the key ingredient to midot and to your spiritual success is to be involved in others. But I'm going to also bless you with the following. In your involvement with others and your involvement with the greater community, that those influences, that Yetzer Hara, that should not have any impact, that should not have influence on you. And let's go back to the text of Rav Kook. Hahitarvutim kol minei anashim. The more that we're involved with a lot of different people, and we need to do that. That's the great bracha, and the great way of improving our own midot is to be involved in others, being concerned with others. Umehem biltim hagunim she'iyavshar lechol chevra limalet mehem. You're going to come in contact with people that may have a bad influence on you, and being out there and being exposed to the street. So there's a lot there that is not necessarily healthy. Alulim lif'ol al pe'ulotav l'ra'ah, and it can have a bad influence on your own actions. Al-kain. Therefore, what is the guest sitting at the table? This is the last part of his bracha, that I'm praying for you. Therefore, he says, Al-kain yipalel kol chatzid she'achareim lo'ochoko litachedim atzibur, that I'm praying that you should be, yes, very involved, very much engaged and engrossed in caring for the tzibur. Lo yishlot satan b'maaseh yadav. But the Satan should not have, I'm praying that it should not influence you. V'lo yuzok, lo b'iskei haguf ve'hamamon, shegam hem totzaot michaya hachevra, v'lo b'iskei hanefesh ve'hamusar. It shouldn't affect your nefesh, it shouldn't affect your musar, your ethics, your morality. U'biyoter tzricha shmira ta'ara machshava. And he says, Rav Kook says, you have to be very, very careful, not only in your actions, but in your thought as well. In machshava. In other words, what you're exposed to could also affect the way that you think. And we want to purify our thoughts as well. We want to maintain a very high level of spirituality, even in thought, in our hearts. Sha'eru va'enoshi yaviet adam lechemdat hakavod hagaon v'hi harut. And by being exposed to larger communities, so we're going to be drawn to certain things that are not necessarily good things. In terms of kavod and hiarut, which is hirhur, we're going to be thinking things that are not necessarily... Again, the more we're exposed to this big world around us, that's not always easy. I think about Chabadniks that are throughout the world, and be able to kind of balance that spiritual life, but also be exposed to the street and the people that they're meeting and the people that they're bringing to their table. To be able to do that is quite an awesome thing. So that's the bracha that we're giving our host, that you're open, you're bringing me into the home, you bring guests into the home. You should continue to do that, to be involved in community and communal life. But I pray that Hashem should watch over you, that the Satan, that the Yetzer Hara, that the negative things that you are exposed to, that it shouldn't affect you at all. Kain, lo yizdaker mizeh shum hirhur chet ve'avera ve'avon. Okay, and one last idea, and we'll close with this. So that, by the way, that's Rav Kook's explanation, his interpretation of this bracha. He breaks down. You see that he breaks down the bracha, really the three parts of the bracha. The opening, praying that the person should not feel embarrassed in any way, that he should be involved in communal life in terms of what that does for building midot. There's nothing that builds midot in a person spiritually like our involvement with others in the lives of others. But the more that we're involved in the lives of others, we also need to be very, very concerned and very careful about the influences of the larger world around us. And therefore, we conclude the bracha with we're blessing the host, that you should be involved, continue to be involved, have an open home. You should be doing kiruv and connecting with more and more people. But we also pray that the Satan, that the Yetzer Hara, with all that exposure, it shouldn't have any negative, any bad influence on you. So that's the bracha, very, very beautiful bracha. And to actually think about, that's, it's one thing to just read it, read it in our siddur, read it in the art scroll, but really to give that bracha, like with our heart, with our soul, to the host. What a beautiful bracha. Especially like yeshiva guys, when they come over, they know about this because they're a little bit more learned. And it's really a beautiful thing when they, you hear from the table that all these people are giving me a bracha, like at the end of the meal. It's a really nice feel. It's a really nice thing to do, and a really nice thing for the host to receive all these brachas at the end of a meal. And we believe that a bracha is a very, very significant thing. Last idea. One last very beautiful idea that Rav Kook says. So Rav Kook says that we should say this bracha. I mean, Rav Kook doesn't say it. The Rambam says it. The Shulchan Aruch says it. The Mishnah Berurah says it. The Aruch HaShulchan says it. Everybody says that we should recite this bracha. But Rav Kook says we should also think about this bracha even when we're not a guest in somebody else's home. Because he says the truth is we're always a guest at the table. Because there is a host. We're only the guest, and there is a great host that is actually providing the meal for us. And of course, that's referring to Hashem. So we should think about the birchat ha'oreach, this bracha that we are the guest at the table, not only when we're sitting at somebody else's table, but even at our own table, to think about that we are the guest at the table. And look at the language of Rav Kook, and we'll just close with this. He says, Umnam, this is the last source on page 2. Umnam gam besudat ha'adam le'atzmo. He says, even when you're having a meal yourself, right? You're sitting in a restaurant, you're sitting at home, sitting with your family, sitting on your own and eating. Yesham hashkafat. There's also this idea, this hashkafa of bal habayit, that there's a bal habayit and there's an oreach, that there's a host and there's a guest. And to think about the fact that there's a host and there's a guest. Writes Rav Kook, V'im hadam yashkif al atzmo. If a person thinks about himself, lisha'a, that you think for a moment, kibal habayit, that you're the bal habayit, you're the host, be'olam hazeh, you're the host in this world, that you have a beautiful home, and you have the food, and you have the means, v'nehene, b'simchad leiv, b'ana'ot ha'aveh, and you think about, you experience the joy that you have this meal, and you're enjoying this meal, and the gift of eating this meal. He says, Ein ra, it's not a bad thing if for a moment you think of yourself as the boss, as the balabayas. That's okay. He says, but only for a moment. Aval rak im kishiyitromem. But then you have to lift yourself up, he says, mizeh. You have to lift yourself from that, and not to think of yourself as the balabayas. Rather, yakir shehu oreach. Think of yourself that you are really the guest sitting at this meal. Uponehu lematara rama, and you are to look at the real purpose and your real goal in life and what it's really all about. Leor hachayim amitim, what is really truth, what is really accurate, and that is that we are all a guest in our home. One of the things that people don't realize about Rav Kook is that he was a chavrusa with a Chafetz Chaim, that they learned together with one another. They had a very, very close relationship. They were both Kohanim, and they both shared a vision of coming back to the land of Israel. The Chafetz Chaim always wanted to come to Eretz Yisrael. We actually have the letter in which he was leaving his community. He bid farewell to the community and finally making Aliyah. And just a day or two later, his wife was ill, was very seriously ill, and he never leaves. But they dreamt together about coming to Yerushalayim, and they dreamt about serving as Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash, the two of them together, and they started to study all the halachos of Kachim, all the halachos of Karbanos. They were getting ready. They felt that we're getting closer and closer to the days of Mashiach. So they had a very close relationship. And there's a whole sefer just about their relationship. It says, Ben Shnei Kohanim Gedolim, the relationship between two great priests, high priests, referring to Rav Kook and the Chafetz Chaim, a very beautiful sefer in Hebrew. But there's probably it's one of the most famous stories of the Chafetz Chaim is, I think it's one of the most famous Jewish stories, but it's worth saying, especially in this context, is the very simple life that he lived. Right? He just had the bed and a little table and a stool in his room. And the story goes that there was a businessman that was coming through Radin, and he stopped in the home of the Chafetz Chaim. And he said to the Chafetz Chaim, you live so simply, and let me help you out a bit, and I can buy you some nice furniture and a nice sofa and a nice bed. So the Chafetz Chaim said to the businessman, he said, well, you're on business here, and tell me about what is it that what does it look like in your hotel room? Right, you're not at home now. You're on business. You're traveling. And he said, "Well, it's relatively simple. I'm just traveling, so I just have a little bit with me, and also just have a bed and a stool." And so the Chafetz Chaim said, "I'm also like a businessman, just traveling. I'm just making my way through. This is Olam Hazeh, right? This is just the journey until Olam Haba. So I live simply here. I'm just a guest, right? I'm like the businessman who's just a guest." So this is what Rav Kook teaches as well when it comes to Birchat HaOreach. So by the way, we should say it. I highly recommend the Aruch HaShulchan, the Mishnah Berurah. Everybody recommends saying it. It's coming back into our benchers, and we should give a bracha to our hosts. What a beautiful thing that is to do. And as Rav Kook says at the end here, we should always think of ourselves when we're sitting at a meal. We can think of ourselves. He says, for a moment, it's okay. Think of yourself as the balabayas, that you're the one in charge, right? That you're the boss, that you're the host. But then take a step back for a moment and to realize that we're all a guest, that we're all just receiving the special blessing and the special time that Hashem has given us in this world. All right, I wish everyone a yashikayach, and I thank you for being here. And if anybody has any questions or comments before we close, yeah, please.
The version in the Siddur says Yizdakeh.
Yeah, Yizdakeh. I see. Yeah, and Yizdakeh. Yeah.
And everywhere else it says Yizdakeh.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's a difference because Yizdakeh means you shouldn't need, and Yizdakeh means it shouldn't stand out.
That's right. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if it's just like a girsa, because the it's like just one letter. It's one letter different. That maybe we.
It's a mistake.
What?
It's a girsa or a.
Yeah. It's probably like a a typo, and then both kind of made its way in. Yes.
So my Rosh Yeshiva was very makpid that we should do this halacha. And the question came up once, if somebody said the harachaman, can they still say the yiratzon? And he just said it's really...
You mean once you say the Rachman hu yivarech balabaya sazeh? Yeah.
So then, because you're yotzei, you made a bracha for the balabaya.
Right.
So he said it's best not to say the harachaman, to say this. And so it could be that because the harachamans became so prevalent in the Sidurim, that's why this fell off.
Yes, that's correct. No, it seems that that's what happened. The question is how that happened. In other words, why did the harachaman, the shorter harachaman, replace what the Gemara and what the Rambam and what the Shulchan Aruch says should be recited?
The Siddur and not reading the Gemara.
Yeah, but it would seem to me that if even if you said that bracha, it would seem to me that there's no problem adding this as well.
Well, it's interesting as you mentioned that the Aruch HaShulchan says that
everyone at the table, men, women, yes.
Like my Rosh Yeshiva was very makpid. Only the
one that's mevarech, right?
They should say it out loud so that everybody.
No, that's correct. So there are different minhagim, right? That's correct. So I think the Brisker, the Soloveitchik family says that only the one that is leading the benching, because that's what the Gemara says, and we kind of like have that tradition from the Gemara. The Aruch HaShulchan says everybody recites it. That was because they understood that was recited in the time of the Gemara. One person was benching, so he was the only one that could say it. Right. But now that everybody around the table is benching, everybody should give the bracha to the balabayas.
Silently or?
So very good, silently. So it seems that the custom is to say it loudly. People will add a little bit extra, like to raise their voice, in order to, because you're giving a bracha to the balabais. As I said before, it's a beautiful thing to hear that bracha. In other words, it's not like a private matter. It's something that you want to, and like the Rambam says, you can even, if you want to add, Rambam says, go for it. Like, here's the text, add a little bit more. Add a little bit more. Give your own bracha at that time. Even though we tend not to do that, and we're very much like, tied to a text, and I think we're probably more comfortable doing that. Sfardim like doing that. They like add more and more, like in a Mishaberach and things. They're like very comfortable doing that. But I think it's a beautiful minhag. You can't go wrong. And it seems many point out that that we've sort of have lost for whatever reason. Again, I think that we have to kind of research that. Somebody needs to do some research, how it was lost, what are the different, possibilities there. But I think it's a beautiful bracha. And as I said, all the major halachic sources all say that it should be recited. Yeah, please.
That's that question. But you said what about is that you said the other one. My son does it the other way around.
Yeah.
He says the Lechat HaOreach,
good,
which that covers the balabait, and then he says balabait, balat,
balas. Right.
Right.
Well, that sounds like what the Rambam says, that once you say this, now you can add more to it. So now you're adding the balabayas, balasabayas.
That's a separate problem.
Yeah. Very nice. All right, Yeshikayach.
Shama shir shir chadai